Officer tries to intimidate a black woman. Seconds later, she exposes her CIA agent status, and he panics. Have you ever wondered what happens when someone underestimates the wrong person? When the tables turn so dramatically it leaves everyone speechless. Today's story will take you into the heart of a dangerous game. A cop with unchecked arrogance tries to intimidate a quiet, confident, black woman, but within seconds, he discovers she's not just any woman. She's someone with authority far beyond his imagination, and his world crumbles in an instant. This story is about justice, power, and what happens when karma strikes back, harder than anyone expects. Stick around, because every twist will keep you at the edge of your seat. Union Station buzzed with the energy of a typical weekday in Washington, D.C. The historic train station, with its grand arches and echoing announcements, played host to a steady stream of commuters, tourists, and government employees. Among them was Sarah Miller, sitting on a bench in the sunlit outdoor plaza, her polished black heels crossed neatly at the ankle. Sarah had always loved this spot. It was where the noise of the city met a strange sense of order, an unspoken rhythm of people rushing to catch trains, taxis honking in the distance, and pigeons darting between feet. She sipped her coffee, the warm, nutty aroma grounding her thoughts. She wasn't in a hurry. Today's mission required patience, observation, and a calm mind. She adjusted her tailored blazer, the rich navy fabric catching the late morning light. She glanced at her phone. Her Uber was 7 minutes away, which gave her enough time to enjoy her coffee before heading to her next meeting. Sarah always blended in. That was her strength, her edge. She was the type of woman you might glance at once and think, sharp dresser, probably a lawyer, before your attention wandered elsewhere. And that was exactly how she wanted it. But today, someone's attention didn't wander. From the corner of her eye, she noticed a uniformed officer walking toward her. He was tall, broad-shouldered, with mirrored sunglasses perched on his face like a shield. His stride was deliberate, almost predatory. Sarah didn't react. She kept sipping her coffee, scrolling idly through her phone as if he weren't there. But she felt the shift in the air, the kind of subtle tension that years of training had taught her to recognize. "Eyes, excuse me, ma'am," the officer said, his tone firm and tinged with suspicion. Sarah looked up, her face a mask of polite curiosity. "Yes. Mind if I see some ID?" He rested one hand on his belt, right next to his holstered weapon. His stance was wide, the kind that said, "I'm in charge here." Sarah blinked, taking in the badge on his chest. Officer David Wilson. Her heart didn't race. Her breathing didn't hitch. Instead, she tilted her head slightly, her dark eyes calm but direct. "Is there a reason you're asking?" "We've had reports of suspicious activity in the area," Wilson said, his voice low but firm. His mirrored sunglasses reflected her image back at her, a composed woman sitting quietly on a bench. "You match the description." Sarah raised an eyebrow. "The description of what exactly?" He hesitated, as if realizing he hadn't thought that far ahead. "Just show me your ID," he barked, his tone sharper now. Sarah exhaled slowly, setting her coffee cup down on the bench beside her. She reached into her purse, pulling out her wallet with deliberate movements. "Sure," she said evenly, handing over her driver's license. "But I'd like to know what this is about." Wilson took the license and scrutinized it, as if it might reveal some hidden secret. His jaw tightened. "You from around here?" "Yes," Sarah replied. "Born and raised in Maryland." "Is there a problem?" "You're acting pretty calm for someone being questioned by law enforcement," he said, his voice laced with suspicion. Sarah let out a soft laugh, not unkind, but not amused either. "Should I be panicking? I haven't done anything wrong." Wilson didn't like that answer. He handed back her license with a snap and crossed his arms. "What are you doing here?" "Drinking coffee," she replied, gesturing to the cup beside her. "Waiting for my ride, same as anyone else." Wilson stepped closer, his shadow falling over her. "You being awfully smart with me, ma'am? I'd suggest you watch your tone." Sarah's eyes flicked up to meet his. They were calm but sharp, cutting through his facade of authority like a scalpel. "And I'd suggest you think carefully about what you're doing right now." For a brief moment, there was silence between them, the bustling noise of Union Station fading into the background. Wilson shifted his weight, his posture rigid. He was used to compliance, to people backing down the moment his tone turned sharp. But Sarah didn't flinch. She didn't cower. She simply sat there, as steady as a granite statue, and let the tension hang. "Ma'am," I'm going to need you to, Wilson began, but before he could finish, a faint ding interrupted him. Sarah glanced at her phone. My ride's here, she said, standing up with smooth, measured movements. She picked up her coffee, her bag, and her phone, all while holding Wilson's gaze. Unless you're planning to arrest me for drinking coffee, I'll be on my way. The officer's hand hovered near his belt again, his fingers twitching. I said you're not going anywhere. Sarah paused. Her expression didn't change, but there was a flicker of something in her eyes, a warning. Slowly, deliberately, she set her coffee back down on the bench and reached into her bag again. Wilson tensed, his hand gripping his weapon now. But what she pulled out wasn't a weapon. It was a slim leather wallet, which she flipped open to reveal a gleaming badge and an ID card. Sarah Miller, she said, her voice steady, quiet, but laced with authority. Central Intelligence Agency. And you've just made a very serious mistake. For a moment, the world seemed to stop. The chatter of passers-by, the faint hum of car engines in the distance, even the fluttering wings of pigeons near the bench, all of it faded into the background. Officer David Wilson stared at the badge in Sarah's hand, the bold lettering of Central Intelligence Agency catching the sunlight. His mirrored sunglasses slid slightly down the bridge of his nose, revealing wide, startled eyes. Sarah stood perfectly still, her composure unshaken. The badge, though small, seemed to carry the weight of the world in that moment, as if it had transformed her from an ordinary citizen into someone untouchable. But it wasn't just the badge. It was the way she held herself, her posture, her confidence, the unshakable calm in her voice. You're lying, Wilson said, his voice lacking the conviction it had just moments earlier. He snorted, as if trying to laugh off the tension. Anyone can buy a fake badge online. Sarah tilted her head slightly, her expression unreadable. Slowly, she closed the badge wallet and slipped it back into her bag. I don't need you to believe me, she said quietly, but you might want to think twice before digging yourself any deeper. Her words hung in the air, sharp and deliberate. Wilson's face flushed red, whether from embarrassment or anger, Sarah couldn't tell. His hand still hovered near his belt, fingers twitching as if he were caught between retreating and doubling down. You're obstructing an investigation, he said, his voice louder now, trying to reassert control. I have every right to detain you. Sarah didn't move. She didn't even blink. What investigation? She asked, her tone calm but pointed. Because from where I'm standing, this looks a lot more like harassment than law enforcement. The word harassment seemed to hit a nerve. Wilson stiffened, his jaw tightening as he glanced around. A small crowd had begun to gather at a distance, drawn by the raised voices and the tension crackling in the air. Some people were filming with their phones, their faces a mix of curiosity and concern. Back off, Wilson barked at the onlookers, waving a hand at them. This is official police business. Move along. The crowd didn't budge. If anything, more people stopped to watch. Sarah remained unfazed, her gaze locked on Wilson, as if the crowd didn't exist. You're making a scene, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. That's not going to help you. Her words were like a scalpel, cutting through Wilson's bravado. He knew she was right, but pride, or perhaps fear, kept him from backing down. He took a step closer, his shadow falling over her once again. Do you think you're above the law? He demanded, his voice low and venomous. Because you flashed some fancy badge, you think you can just... Officer Wilson. A sharp, authoritative voice cut through the tension like a whip. Both Sarah and Wilson turned to see a second officer approaching. She was a tall woman with short, cropped hair and a no-nonsense expression. Her name tag read Sergeant Susan Kelly. Her uniform was immaculate, her movements brisk and efficient as she closed the distance between them. What's going on here? Kelly demanded, her eyes flicking between Wilson and Sarah. She took in the scene quickly, the tense posture of her subordinate, the calm but firm demeanor of the woman in front of him, the murmuring crowd with their phones held high. Sergeant, I was questioning this woman, Wilson began, but Kelly raised a hand to silence him. Is that true? She asked Sarah directly, her tone professional but not unkind. Yes, Sarah replied. He approached me without cause, demanded my ID, and when I complied, he escalated without explanation. Kelly's gaze sharpened. Do you have identification? I do, Sarah said, reaching into her bag once more. She held out her badge wallet, flipping it open to reveal her CIA credentials. Agent Sarah Miller, Central Intelligence Agency. Kelly's eyebrows lifted ever so slightly, but her expression remained neutral. She took the badge, inspecting it closely. Then she glanced up at Sarah. "May I verify this?" "Please do," Sarah said, her voice steady. Kelly nodded and stepped aside, pulling out her radio. Wilson, meanwhile, looked as though the ground might swallow him whole. He shifted uncomfortably, his hand now nowhere near his belt. He glanced at Sarah, then at the crowd, his face pale and sweaty. Minutes ticked by as Kelly spoke into her radio, confirming Sarah's credentials. The crowd murmured among themselves, their phones still recording. Sarah remained motionless, her eyes scanning the plaza as though nothing unusual were happening. She spotted her Uber idling a short distance away, the driver glancing curiously at the scene. Finally, Kelly returned, handing the badge back to Sarah with a nod of respect. "Agent Miller, your credentials check out. I apologize for the inconvenience." "No apology necessary, Sergeant," Sarah replied. Her tone was polite, but there was an edge to it, a quiet insistence that this situation wasn't going to be brushed aside so easily. Kelly turned to Wilson, her expression hardening. "Officer Wilson, a word." "Now." Wilson opened his mouth to protest, but the look on Kelly's face silenced him. He followed her a few steps away, out of earshot, though Sarah could still see the tension in their body language. Kelly's sharp gestures, Wilson's slumped shoulders. It was clear who was in charge now. Sarah took a deep breath, allowing the moment to settle. She reached for her coffee, taking one last sip before tossing the cup into a nearby trash can. The crowd was beginning to disperse, sensing that the drama was over. But Sarah knew this was only the beginning. Her phone buzzed in her hand. It was a text from her supervisor. "Call me ASAP. Need an update on the operation." Sarah glanced back at Kelly and Wilson, the latter now looking thoroughly chastised. Then she turned and walked toward her waiting Uber, her heels clicking softly against the pavement. She slid into the back seat, her expression calm, but her mind already calculating her next move. The situation hadn't derailed her mission, but it had added a complication she couldn't ignore. Wilson's face, his name, his actions, they were all now etched in her memory, and Sarah Miller never forgot. Not when justice was still owed. The hum of the car engine filled the silence as Sarah sat in the back of the Uber, gazing out at the streets of Washington, D.C. The city seemed to glide by in slow motion, its iconic landmarks bathed in the soft, golden hue of the afternoon sun. The Washington Monument stood tall in the distance, a stark reminder of the ideals this city was meant to represent: justice, equality, liberty. But moments like the one she'd just endured told a different story. Her phone buzzed again, a persistent vibration against her palm. She looked down at the screen. Her supervisor's name, Director Frank Davis, flashed across the display. A man of few words, but razor-sharp precision, Davis rarely reached out unless the situation demanded it. She swiped to answer, bringing the phone to her ear. "Miller here," she said, her voice steady. "You good?" Davis's gravelly voice came through, tinged with concern. "Yes," Sarah replied, her tone measured. "There was a minor incident. It's been handled." Davis didn't respond immediately. She could picture him on the other end, sitting in his cluttered Langley office, his brow furrowed as he processed her words. "Define minor," he finally said. Sarah let out a soft sigh, her gaze drifting back to the passing streets. "An overzealous cop decided to question me without cause. It escalated briefly, but I identified myself. Local law enforcement verified my credentials, and it ended there." There was a pause, and then Davis said, "Name?" "Officer David Wilson," Sarah said evenly. "D.C. Metro Police." Another pause. This time, it stretched long enough for Sarah to glance at the phone, checking if the call had dropped. But just as she opened her mouth to speak, Davis cut in. "Wilson," he said, his tone sharper now. "I've heard that name. He's been flagged before. Complaints of excessive force, racial profiling. Nothing ever sticks, though." Sarah's jaw tightened. Of course, she thought. It wasn't surprising, but it still hit like a punch to the gut. "I didn't let him off easy," she said. His sergeant pulled him aside. "I'm guessing he's already getting an earful." "That's not enough," Davis said, his voice cold and certain. "We can't let this kind of behavior slide. Not when it involves one of our agents." Sarah didn't respond immediately, her thoughts churning, sifting through the layers of the situation. "What do you want me to do?" she finally asked. "Stay on task for now," Davis replied. "But keep your eyes open. If there's more to this guy than a bruised ego and bad judgment, I want to know about it. And if this impacts the operation, you call me immediately. Understood, Sarah said, her tone clipped. The call ended with a decisive click, and Sarah set the phone down in her lap. She stared out the window, watching the world blur past as the car wove through traffic. The conversation had left a bitter taste in her mouth, not because of Davis's orders, but because of the truth they hinted at. Wilson wasn't just a rogue cop having a bad day. He was part of a larger, more insidious pattern, one that Sarah had seen too many times before. The Uber slowed to a stop in front of a sleek, modern office building in Arlington. Sarah stepped out, her heels clicking softly against the pavement. She adjusted her bag, straightened her blazer, and took a deep breath. The day wasn't over, and there was still work to be done. Inside the building, the air was cool and quiet, a stark contrast to the bustling streets outside. Sarah entered a private conference room on the 12th floor, where two other agents were already waiting. Agent Lisa Wong and Agent Mark Evans greeted her with nods, their faces serious. "You're late," Mark said, though there was no real heat in his voice. His sandy blonde hair was slightly disheveled, and a half-empty cup of coffee sat on the table in front of him. "Got held up," Sarah replied, taking a seat across from him. "Local law enforcement." Mark raised an eyebrow. "You good?" "I'm fine," Sarah said, "but it's a reminder of what we're up against." Lisa leaned forward, her dark eyes sharp. "Was it connected to the operation?" Sarah shook her head. "No, just bad timing. But it reinforced something we can't ignore. This city has cracks, and they run deep. If we're not careful, we'll fall right through them." The room fell silent for a moment, the weight of her words settling over them like a thick fog. The operation they were working on, a covert investigation into corruption within local law enforcement, was already fraught with challenges. But now, with Wilson's face and name fresh in her mind, Sarah felt a new urgency. "Let's focus," she said, straightening in her chair. "What's the latest?" Lisa pulled up a digital file on her tablet, sliding it across the table to Sarah. "We've confirmed that Officer Wilson has ties to a network of off-duty officers running private security gigs. The problem is, these gigs aren't legal. They're extorting businesses in exchange for protection." Mark added, "We've got audio recordings, surveillance footage, enough to raise eyebrows, but not enough to blow the whole thing wide open. We need someone on the inside." Sarah studied the file, her mind racing. Wilson's face flashed in her memory. The arrogance, the twitch of his fingers near his belt, the way he looked at her like she didn't belong. "What's my role?" she asked, her voice calm but resolute. "You're our in," Mark said. "We flagged you as a person of interest in their system. Wilson's encounter with you today wasn't random. It's likely he was testing the waters, seeing if you'd react under pressure. You just became a potential target for their operation." Lisa leaned back in her chair, her expression grim. "They're going to watch you now, follow you, push boundaries. If there's something deeper at play, we need you to draw it out." Sarah nodded slowly, her mind already piecing together the next steps. The encounter with Wilson wasn't just a hiccup. It was the opening move in a larger game, and now, she was on the board. As Sarah left the building that evening, the weight of the day pressed heavily on her shoulders. The sun had dipped low in the sky, casting long shadows across the city. Her phone buzzed again, but this time, she ignored it. She needed a moment to think, to breathe, to prepare. The cracks in the city ran deep, but Sarah Miller had spent her life navigating fault lines. She wasn't afraid of falling through. She was here to expose them and to make sure that when the pieces finally crumbled, they didn't get put back together the same way. And Officer David Wilson? He was about to learn just how deep those cracks went. The rhythmic tap of Sarah's heels echoed through the quiet hallway of her Georgetown brownstone as she unlocked the door. It was late, the city outside bathed in the soft glow of streetlights. Inside, the space was minimal yet warm. Sleek furniture in neutral tones, bookshelves lined with titles ranging from espionage histories to poetry anthologies. She closed the door behind her and exhaled deeply, the weight of the day pressing against her like a heavy coat she couldn't shrug off. Setting her bag on the entry table, she shrugged off her blazer and hung it neatly on the back of a chair. The silence of her home was a sharp contrast to the noise in her head. Every detail of the encounter with Officer Wilson replayed in her mind. The way he had looked at her, the way his tone had shifted from suspicion to control. She could still see his hand hovering near his belt, his fingers twitching with the threat of force. Not random, she thought. her fingers brushing the edge of the badge wallet, still in her bag. Wilson's arrogance hadn't been a fluke. It had been deliberate, calculated. He'd pushed her to see how far she'd been before she broke. But Sarah Miller didn't break. She moved to the kitchen, the soft glow of pendant lights illuminating the granite countertops. Pulling out her phone, she dialed Davis's number. He picked up on the second ring. "Miller," he said, his voice sharp. "What's the update?" "I've reviewed the file," she replied, leaning against the counter. "Wilson's deeper in this than we thought. The private security gigs, they're a front. He's part of a larger network. Extortion, money laundering, possibly even arms trafficking. The operation we're running might overlap with his activities." There was a pause on the other end of the line. When Davis spoke again, his tone was colder. "You're saying he's not just a crooked cop, he's a liability to our mission?" "Exactly," Sarah said. "And now that I'm flagged in their system, he's going to keep testing me. They think I'm just a civilian who got too close. That's an advantage." "You sure about that?" Davis asked. There was an edge to his voice, a faint trace of doubt. "These guys play dirty. If they find out who you really are." "They won't," Sarah interrupted, her voice firm. "I've handled worse. This isn't my first operation, and it won't be my last." Davis let out a heavy sigh. "All right, but keep your head down. Wilson's not a loose thread anymore. He's part of the knot. You pull too hard, the whole thing could unravel." "That's the idea," Sarah said quietly. After ending the call, she poured herself a glass of water and stood by the window, staring out at the quiet street below. A few neighbors were still awake, their windows glowing softly. She could see a couple walking their dog, their laughter faint but audible in the stillness. It was a scene of normalcy, a reminder of what she was fighting for, a world where people like Wilson couldn't prey on the vulnerable, where justice wasn't a privilege but a right. Her phone buzzed again, pulling her from her thoughts. This time, it wasn't Davis. The screen displayed a text from a blocked number. Sarah's heart didn't race. Her breathing didn't falter. She had long ago trained herself to meet the unexpected with calm. "Unknown number. You looked real comfortable out there today. Careful. Some of us don't like trespassers." She read the message twice, her mind immediately breaking it down. It wasn't overtly threatening, but the undertone was clear. They were watching. Wilson wasn't wasting time. He was already trying to rattle her. Sarah placed the phone on the counter, her expression unchanging. She walked to her bedroom and opened the closet, reaching past rows of tailored suits and neatly pressed shirts to a small safe hidden in the corner. With a few quick turns of the dial, the safe clicked open, revealing a slim laptop and a secured file drive. She set the laptop on her desk and powered it on. The screen glowed softly in the dim room, the CIA's secure operating system booting up. Within minutes, she was accessing surveillance feeds and background checks tied to Wilson's name. If he wanted to rattle her, he'd have to do better than a cryptic text. She was about to make his life far more complicated than he could imagine. Wilson's personnel file was exactly what she expected, clean on the surface, but with just enough red flags to suggest he wasn't the golden boy he pretended to be. Excessive force complaints, a suspension that had mysteriously been overturned, and a handful of glowing performance reviews that read more like cover stories than genuine praise. Sarah leaned back in her chair, her mind piecing the puzzle together. Wilson wasn't acting alone. He was protected, insulated. Someone was pulling the strings, and Wilson was just the muscle. She pulled up the recordings Lisa and Mark had flagged earlier. Audio clips of Wilson talking to business owners, his voice dripping with false charm as he offered them protection in exchange for cash. The more she listened, the clearer it became. Wilson was bold because he believed he was untouchable, and, in his world, he probably was. Until now. The next morning, Sarah was up before dawn. She dressed in her usual sharp attire, her movements precise and deliberate. Today wasn't about blending in. It was about being seen. Wilson wanted to test her? She'd give him something to see. As she stepped out of her brownstone, the cool morning air greeted her, sharp and bracing. She glanced down the street, her trained eyes catching the unmarked car idling at the corner. It was subtle, no overt movements, no glaring signs of surveillance. But Sarah knew the signs. She was being followed. She smiled to herself, a small, knowing smile. If Wilson's network thought they could intimidate her, they were about to learn just how wrong they were. Sarah Miller wasn't a trespasser. She was the storm they didn't see coming, and storms had a way of uprooting everything in their path. The faint chill of the morning air brushed against Sarah's skin as she strode down the tree-lined street, her heels striking the pavement in an even rhythm. Her polished navy blazer caught the soft rays of the early sun, casting a faint glow around her silhouette. She wasn't rushing, and she wasn't hiding. Every step was deliberate, her pace steady, her head held high. Behind her, the unmarked car moved slowly, its engine a faint hum against the stillness of the morning. The tinted windows revealed nothing, but Sarah could feel the gaze of whoever sat inside. She didn't look back. That would be too obvious, and Sarah Miller didn't make rookie mistakes. Instead, she let the city around her fill her senses, the quiet murmur of early risers walking their dogs, the rhythmic squeak of a newspaper delivery bike passing by, the distant clatter of garbage trucks in an alley. These were the sounds of the surface, routine, predictable, comforting. But just beneath them, in the places no one wanted to look, was where the real Washington, D.C. pulsed. And it was there, in the shadows, that Sarah worked best. At the end of the block, Sarah stopped at a small cafe. It was a modest spot, nestled between a dry cleaner and a bookstore that hadn't opened yet. She'd chosen it for its unobtrusiveness and its clear line of sight to the street outside. The glass facade allowed her to keep an eye on the car without appearing to care. The bell above the door jingled softly as she entered. The air inside was warm, filled with the comforting scent of freshly brewed coffee and baked goods. A barista glanced up from the counter and greeted her with a smile. Sarah returned it with polite efficiency, moving toward a corner table near the window. As she waited for her coffee, she pulled out her phone and casually scrolled through her emails. To anyone watching, she looked like another professional starting her day, a woman catching up on work before heading to the office. But in reality, her attention was divided. The reflections in the glass gave her a clear view of the street outside. The car had parked across the road, its engine now silent. The driver hadn't stepped out. Good, she thought. That meant they weren't confident enough to make a move yet. They were testing her, trying to gauge her reaction. She let them watch. Her coffee arrived, steaming in a white ceramic mug. She wrapped her hands around it, letting the warmth seep into her fingers. It was a simple act, but it grounded her. Today would require focus, patience, and a willingness to push the boundaries of control. She was ready. By the time she left the cafe, the morning had grown busier. The sidewalks were filling with commuters, the hum of the city rising steadily. Sarah blended into the crowd, her pace unchanged. She didn't need to look back to know the car was following her again. She could feel it, like an itch at the base of her neck. Her destination wasn't far, a nondescript office building a few blocks away, its exterior as unremarkable as its name, Hayworth and Associates. To anyone else, it looked like an insurance firm or a low-level lobbying group. But behind its beige walls was one of the CIA's many covert field offices. Sarah entered through the front, her badge already tucked away. The receptionist gave her a brief nod before pressing a button under the desk. The elevator at the far end of the lobby dinged, its doors sliding open. Sarah stepped inside, feeling the faint hum of hidden security scanners as the elevator began its descent. The conference room she entered was stark and utilitarian, its walls bare except for a mounted screen displaying a map of the city. Agents Wong and Evans were already there, seated on opposite sides of the table. Both looked up as Sarah walked in, their expressions serious. "You're being followed," Evans said, skipping any preamble. "I know," Sarah replied, pulling out her chair and sitting down. "Unmarked sedan. Parked outside the cafe I stopped at. Been trailing me since I left my house." Lisa leaned forward, her brow furrowed. "Wilson's people, almost certainly. They're trying to rattle me," Sarah said. "The message I got last night proves it." Evans raised an eyebrow. "Message?" Sarah pulled out her phone, scrolling to the text and setting it on the table for them to see. Evans leaned closer, reading the words aloud. "You looked real comfortable out there today. Careful. Some of us don't like trespassers." He let out a low whistle. "Subtle." Lisa didn't look amused. "Did you respond?" "Of course not," Sarah said. "But it tells us a lot. They're watching closely enough to know my movements, but they haven't confirmed anything yet. If they had, we wouldn't be having this conversation. They're fishing," Lisa said, leaning back in her chair. "Trying to figure out if you're a threat. Then let's give them an answer," Evans said, his tone sharper now. "You want to draw them out, push back, make them think they've underestimated you." Sarah considered this, her fingers tracing the edge of her phone. It was a delicate balance. Push too hard, and they might back off completely, retreating into the shadows where they'd be harder to track. Push too little, and they'd see her as an easy target. "We need to keep them close," she said finally. "Close enough to watch, but not so close they smell a trap." Lisa nodded. "Agreed. We'll monitor the sedan. If they escalate, we'll intercept. Until then, you're the bait." Evan smirked. "How do you feel about that?" Sarah met his gaze, her expression unreadable. "I feel like they don't know what they've started." After the meeting, Sarah returned to the surface with a renewed sense of purpose. The day was just beginning, and so was the game. As she stepped back onto the busy street, the unmarked sedan slid into view at the corner of her eye. This time, she smiled, just a small, fleeting curve of her lips. Let them watch, she thought. Let them think they're in control. Because when the time came, she'd show them just how wrong they were. And when that time came, there would be no shadows deep enough to hide in. The chapter ends with Sarah walking confidently down the bustling street, her figure blending into the crowd. The unmarked car followed, its presence a silent challenge she was more than ready to meet. The late afternoon sunlight cast long shadows across the streets of Washington, D.C., as Sarah made her way to the next stage of her plan. The city was alive with its usual rhythm, the honking of impatient taxis, the steady stream of professionals rushing to finish their day, the chatter of tourists marveling at landmarks. But for Sarah, every detail was a potential clue, every movement in her periphery a signal. The unmarked sedan remained in its predictable position, tailing her from a comfortable distance. It wasn't subtle, not to someone trained like her. But that was the point. They wanted her to notice. They wanted her to feel the weight of their gaze. She didn't. Instead, she let her steps guide her to a place she knew well. A small, nondescript bookstore tucked away on a quiet street near DuPont Circle. Its weathered sign read, Morrison's Books and Bindery, a place that, to most, looked like a relic of a forgotten era. Inside, the scent of aged paper and ink hung heavy in the air, wrapping the space in a cocoon of nostalgia. The bell above the door gave a soft chime as she entered, her eyes adjusting to the dim lighting. A man in his 60s, wearing round glasses and a cardigan that looked older than Sarah herself, looked up from behind the counter. His expression softened into a faint smile of recognition. "Sarah," he said, his voice low and warm. "It's been a while." "Hello, Robert," she replied, her tone easy but deliberate. "It has. How's business?" "As good as it can be when you're selling forgotten things to a world that's already moved on," he said with a chuckle, motioning for her to come closer. "But something tells me you didn't come here for the latest first editions." "Not today," Sarah said, her lips curving into a faint smile. She lowered her voice. "I need the room." Robert nodded, his demeanor instantly shifting from friendly shopkeeper to discreet ally. Without another word, he gestured toward the back of the store. Sarah followed, weaving through narrow aisles stacked with books and leather-bound journals, until they reached a door marked Employees Only. Robert unlocked it with a small brass key and pushed it open. "Take your time," he said, stepping aside to let her through. "Let me know if you need anything." "Thank you," Sarah said, giving him a brief nod before stepping into the room. The back room was unassuming, lined with bookshelves and crates of unsorted inventory. But the center held a polished oak table, bare except for a single lamp and a laptop that Robert had set up earlier, as instructed. The air was cooler here, the faint hum of an air purifier in the corner the only sound. Sarah closed the door behind her and sat down at the table. She powered on the laptop, its screen flickering to life with a secure CIA login interface. Typing in her credentials, she accessed the encrypted network, pulling up the data that Wong and Evans had flagged earlier. Surveillance footage, financial records, intercepted communications. The information began to fill the screen, each one another thread in the web she was trying to untangle. Her focus sharpened as she sifted through the information, her mind piecing together the connections. Wilson's network wasn't small. It spanned beyond D.C., touching neighboring jurisdictions and even private security firms contracted by corporate entities. But there was something else, a name that kept appearing in the files. Archer Logistics. Sarah clicked on the name, bringing up a file marked with a high-interest tag. It was a company based in Northern Virginia, officially listed as a freight logistics provider. But the flag data suggested otherwise. Discrepancies in their shipping manifests, payments routed through offshore accounts, and connections to individuals tied to law enforcement. Archer Logistics, Sarah murmured to herself, her fingers tracing the edge of the table. It was a lead, one she hadn't anticipated but couldn't ignore. Wilson wasn't just a crooked cop. He was a cog in a much larger machine, and Archer Logistics might be the hub. She began drafting a report for Davis, detailing her findings and requesting additional resources for deeper surveillance. But before she could finish, her phone buzzed on the table, the vibration cutting through the quiet room. The screen lit up with a number she didn't recognize. Her instincts flared, but she answered, her voice calm. "This is Miller." A pause, then a voice, low and deliberately unsteady, came through the line. "You've been asking a lot of questions." Sarah didn't respond immediately, letting the words settle. She recognized the tactic, a calculated attempt to rattle her. But her pulse remained steady. "Who is this?" she asked, her tone neutral. "You know who I am," the voice replied. "And I know who you are." The line went dead. Sarah stared at the phone for a moment, her mind racing through possibilities. The call wasn't random, and it wasn't a bluff. Whoever it was, they knew enough to make contact. It was a warning, but it was also a mistake. They'd revealed themselves, even if just a little. She quickly pulled up her phone's metadata logs, extracting the number and tracing its origin. As she worked, her thoughts crystallized. Wilson's network was watching her, more closely than she'd realized. The game had shifted, and the first move had been made. By the time Sarah left the bookstore, the sun was setting, painting the city in shades of amber and gold. The unmarked sedan was still there, its windows dark and impenetrable. But now, she didn't see it as a threat. It was an opportunity. Walking past the car, she allowed herself a brief glance at her reflection in the side mirror. Her expression was calm, unreadable. She didn't need to look inside to know they were watching her. And as she disappeared into the crowd, a small, satisfied smile touched her lips. They thought they were hunting her. They didn't realize she'd already set the trap. Sarah moved through the crowd with practiced ease, her sharp eyes taking in every detail around her. The evening air had cooled, and the city buzzed with a different kind of energy. Restaurants filling with patrons, streetlights flickering to life, and the faint hum of music spilling out from bars and cafes. She didn't need to look back to know the unmarked sedan was following her again, inching through the traffic, its headlights dimmed but persistent. Her phone vibrated once in her pocket. She pulled it out discreetly, glancing at the encrypted message from Agent Wong. "Backup ready. Green light when you're set." Sarah tapped out a quick reply. "Stand by. They're biting." Her path took her to a quiet industrial district on the outskirts of the city, where the streets were wide but nearly empty, lit only by sporadic streetlights and the occasional passing car. This was intentional. She had chosen this location carefully, knowing it offered the perfect mix of isolation and controlled visibility. She turned down an alley, her steps echoing softly against the brick walls. The air here was damp and carried the faint scent of oil and metal. She stopped near a set of rusted loading docks, the glow from a single overhead light casting her shadow long and thin against the pavement. She waited. The unmarked sedan appeared moments later, creeping to a stop at the mouth of the alley. Its engine idled for a long moment, the sound reverberating through the narrow space. Then, the driver's side door opened, and a man stepped out. He was tall, broad-shouldered, and dressed in plain clothes that tried too hard to blend in. Sarah recognized him immediately, one of Wilson's men, his face matching the file she'd studied earlier, Jack Taylor. He wasn't subtle, and that worked to her advantage. "You've been busy," Taylor said, his voice carrying an edge of mockery as he approached. His hand rested casually at his side, but Sarah caught the faint bulge of a holstered weapon beneath his jacket. "Asking questions, digging around where you don't belong. That's dangerous, you know." Sarah didn't flinch. She crossed her arms, tilting her head slightly. "Dangerous for whom?" Taylor smirked, but it didn't reach his eyes. "You're funny, I'll give you that. But this isn't a game. People like you, people who don't know their place, tend to get hurt. And what place would that be?" Sarah asked, her tone as steady as stone. "Far away from here," Taylor replied, his voice hardening. He took another step forward, his shadow now overlapping hers. "This is your last warning. Stop asking questions. Walk away." Sarah's lips curved into a faint smile, but her eyes stayed sharp. "You followed me all this way just to deliver a warning? That's cute." The smirk fell from Taylor's face, replaced by something darker. He took another step forward, But before he could say anything more, the faint click of a radio transmission crackled through the air. "Hold your position," came Wong's voice in Sarah's earpiece, barely audible. Sarah didn't move. Her posture relaxed, but ready. She watched as Taylor's confidence wavered, ever so slightly. He wasn't used to being challenged, especially not by someone who wasn't intimidated by his presence. "You think you're untouchable, don't you?" he said, his voice low, almost a growl. "No," Sarah replied, her tone cool. "I just think you're sloppy." Taylor's face twisted in confusion for a split second before the sound of approaching footsteps filled the alley. From both ends, plainclothes agents emerged, their weapons drawn but held low, in a non-threatening stance. Wong and Evans led the team, their expressions sharp and focused. Taylor spun around, his hand moving toward his weapon, but a sharp command froze him in place. "Don't even think about it," Evans barked, his gun now aimed squarely at Taylor's chest. "Hands where we can see them." Taylor hesitated, his gaze darting around as if searching for an escape. But it was clear there wasn't one. Slowly, he raised his hands, his jaw clenched tight with anger. Sarah stepped forward, her movements deliberate, her presence commanding. She stopped just a foot away from Taylor, her gaze steady and unyielding. "Here's the thing about people like you," she said, her voice calm but cutting. "You think fear is power. You think intimidation makes you strong. But you don't even realize how fragile your little empire is." Taylor glared at her, but said nothing. Behind him, Wong and Evans moved in, cuffing his hands and patting him down for weapons. They retrieved his gun, a burner phone, and a small notebook stuffed into his jacket pocket. "You have no idea what you're messing with," Taylor spat, his voice laced with defiance. Sarah leaned in slightly, her tone dropping to a near whisper. "Oh, I know exactly what I'm messing with. And so do you." She stepped back, nodding to Wong, who signaled the rest of the team to sweep the area. Within minutes, the sedan was searched, its trunk revealing a stash of unregistered firearms and cache enough evidence to tie Taylor to Wilson's network. The operation unfolded with precision, each step calculated to bring down the entire network. The evidence pulled from Taylor's burner phone provided the break Sarah's team needed. Text messages, call logs, and encrypted communications all pointed directly to Wilson's involvement with Archer Logistics. The company wasn't just a logistics provider. It was the nerve center of an illegal operation spanning multiple states, trafficking weapons and laundering money with the help of corrupt officials. Sarah worked tirelessly, coordinating with federal agencies to prepare simultaneous raids on key locations tied to the network. Warehouses, offices, and private properties were marked for operation. The warrants were secured, and at dawn 2 days later, the raids began. The sound of boots on the ground echoed through the corridors of Wilson's suburban home as a tactical team breached the door. Caught off guard, Wilson stumbled out of bed, his confusion quickly turning to panic as armed agents swarmed his house. By the time he was let out in handcuffs, his face was pale, his confidence shattered. In his garage, agents found damning evidence, stacks of cash, unregistered firearms, and documents tying him to Archer Logistics. His clean record was obliterated in an instant, replaced by undeniable proof of his crimes. Days later, Sarah stood behind the one-way glass of a federal interrogation room, watching Wilson slumped in his chair. The man who had once strutted around with unchecked arrogance now looked small, defeated. He avoided eye contact with the investigator seated across from him, his hands fidgeting in his lap. The investigator's voice was steady but relentless. "We've got everything. Transactions, records, witness statements. The network is falling apart, and your name is all over it. The only question now is how much damage you want to take when this goes to trial." Wilson didn't respond. His silence was a weak shield against the mountain of evidence crashing down on him. Every ounce of his bravado had been stripped away, leaving behind a man who realized, too late, that his power had always been borrowed. And now it was gone. Sarah stepped away from the glass, her expression calm but resolute. Wilson's downfall was just one piece of a larger mission, but it was a piece that mattered. His actions had hurt too many people, and now, justice had caught up with him. The dismantling of Archer Logistics was swift and thorough. Sarah's team traced its operations across state lines, uncovering ties to politicians, corporate executives, and other corrupt law enforcement officers. Each raid revealed more evidence, more connections, and more players in the sprawling web of crime. By the end of the week, over a dozen arrests had been made, and the story dominated national headlines. Archer Logistics was exposed as a front for illegal arms trafficking, and Wilson's name was dragged through the mud alongside his associates. A week after the operation's conclusion, Sarah sat at her favorite cafe, sipping coffee as she scrolled through her phone. News reports detailed the fallout, Wilson's arrest, the collapse of the network, and the ongoing investigations into others involved. Justice wasn't perfect, but it was a start. Her phone buzzed with a message from Davis. "Well done, Miller. The city owes you more than it knows." Sarah smiled faintly and put the phone down. For her, it wasn't about recognition. It was about knowing that the cracks in the system had been exposed and that those responsible would face the consequences. As she stepped out of the cafe and into the bustling streets, she felt the familiar energy of the city around her. There was still work to be done, still battles to fight. But for now, she let herself enjoy the quiet satisfaction of a job well done. Because in the end, the truth had prevailed and justice had been served. Wilson had underestimated her, and that had been his greatest mistake. A week later, Sarah is in observation room of a federal interrogation. She watched as Officer Wilson sits across from the investigator. His once cocky demeanor is now gone. It is replaced with a nervous habit. He fidgets in his chair. He knows the game is finally over. His network had been dismantled. All key players have been arrested. All illegal operations exposed. Archer Logistics turned out to be nothing but a front. It hid illegal arms and trafficking. Corrupt officials from different states were connected to it. Officer Wilson's name is now ruined. He is connected to nothing but betrayal. His career and reputation is completely shattered. Sarah watches him for one more moment and turns away. She knows her work here is finished. Cracks in the city were exposed. It is not perfect, but it is a great start. She steps out into the warm and steady sun. For the first time in many days, she feels at peace. Justice is not fast all the time. It is also not very clean, but it is worth the continuous fight. Sarah walks away peacefully. She won this battle, but the war continues.